We are so excited to have you all here. We're excited to be back at the Park Avenue Armory, and we are thrilled to have this talk going on right now on a long arc photography and the American South since 1845, much sooner. Let me introduce myself. My name is Andra Russick. I am from Scheinbaum and Russick Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'm also the chair of the Education Committee for APAD. And we put together all the APAD talks that are going on this weekend, and as also all the Zoom talks that we have had throughout the year, which can be found on the APAD website. Now let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Sarah Kennel joined the VMFA in 2021 as the inaugural Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography and Director of the Razor Center for Works on Paper. She has curated, published, and presented widely on topics ranging from 19th century French photography and historic photographic processes to European modernism and understudied women photographers. Gregory Harris is the Donald and Marilyn Keough Family Curator of Photography at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. He specializes in contemporary photography with a particular interest in documentary practices. He has curated over a dozen exhibitions that consider an array of topics, including social justice, the intersections of photography and self-taught art, and distinct history of photography in the South. And then we have our artists who are part of the exhibition that they have curated together. Carolyn Drake is an artist and photographer based in California. Her work has been supported by the Guggenheim Fellowship, Lightwork, and the Honoré Cartier-Bresson Foundation. She has authored 5 photo books and is a member of Magnum Photos. Her practice embraces collaboration and has in recent years melded photography, sewing, collage, and sculpture. RaMell Ross is an artist, filmmaker, writer, and liberated documentarian. He has been awarded an Aaron Siskind Foundation Individual Photographers Fellowship, Howard Foundation Fellowship, and a USA Artists Fellowship, and was a 2022 Solomon Fellow at Harvard University. His work is in various public and private collections, such as the Museum of Modern Art, Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the High Museum. And with that, I would like to pass it on to our panel and let them tell you all about this amazing exhibition that they have going on. Thank you all for being here, and please enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Very good. RaMell, were you also nominated for an Oscar?
I was.
Didn't think we should leave that out.
I just need to leave it.
No,
And he was nominated for an Oscar.
it's okay. Everyone will be one day.
So thank you all for coming. Sarah and I are going to give a quick overview of A Long Arc, because I don't imagine that many of you have had a chance to see it yet, so we want to give you a kind of a foundation for the conversation, and then we're going to turn to RaMell and Carolyn and have them tell us about our work. So the exhibition opened at the High Museum of Art this past September, and is currently up at the Addison Gallery of American Art in Andover, Massachusetts. If you're feeling like a road trip, it's not all that long of a drive from New York. But the show is a survey of the history of photography in the South. What we were trying to do with this exhibition was to see if we could tell the story of American photography, but put the South at the center of that story rather than having it be kind of a peripheral character in the history of photography. Usually, the way that the history of American photography is told, there's an emphasis on New York, the Bay Area, Chicago maybe, these kind of major urban centers. And the South is kind of touched on here and there, but it's rarely ever focused on in any particular way. And one of the things that we noticed as we were digging into this topic is that the South is really very crucial to the development of American photography. So at these real kind of pivot points in American history, important things seem to happen with photography in the South, whether that's the documentation of the Civil War, the records of the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement. Right now, there's all kinds of amazing work that's being made in the South. And so we wanted to retell that story with the South at the center. Most of the work is from the High's collection. About a third of the High's photography collection is by Southern photographers or of Southern subject matter. So it's a major part of our collection. So we're pretty uniquely situated to be able to tell this story. One of the kind of themes that we were thinking about is how the South is one of the most
Sorry,
is it not-
quicker.
Oh,
there we
go.
go. Okay,
So-
you pointed at the ceiling. Okay, now it's going too.
We're going to cycle through some highlights of the exhibition. The South is one of the most kind of stereotyped and mythologized places in the U.S., and whether that's through film or literature, music. But we're going to look at how photography is part of that and think about how some of these stereotypes or these notions that we have about the South are in some ways true, how they're false, how they may be over-embellished, but really dig into those contradictions and kind of see how we could tease that out in photographs.
So the exhibition is organized in 7 sections, roughly chronologically. And one of the challenges of doing a huge topic like almost 180 years of photography in a very diverse geographic area, diverse socially, landscape, economically. I mean, there's so many different areas to touch on. Is that we ended up deciding that we were going to try to bring a mix in of sort of the well-known artists that you would expect to see on any kind of textbook of the history of the South, the Barnard Civil War pictures, but we also wanted to bring in artists and practices like vernacular photography that you may not necessarily think of. So it's not a greatest hit show, but it's not the undiscovered South either. We really wanted to also bring these practices into dialogue because, of course, photographers working at the time are not necessarily making those distinctions that historians make later. Sorry. There we go. Within this chronology, too, as I mentioned, we're sort of bringing in these different practices. And we also, of course, have our own slant on things. I mean, this show is a sort of response to, in some ways, the next generation response to a show, Picture in the South, that opened at the High Museum in 1996. That was really part of that museum's kind of making a claim to being the center for history of photography in the South. And the concerns at that time, many of which were sort of thinking about the South and literary practices, from this perspective and from where we are now, we are thinking deeply about questions of sort of race, labor, environment, questions that really impact us now. And I think more broadly, too, the practices that we are bringing in to dialogue also deal with broader questions, not just of Southern distinctiveness, but really actually who we are as Americans. So the 7 sections sort of do follow the general sweep of the chronology. The last thing I'll say about our selection, because I hope you all buy the book, which is conveniently on sale across the way, or come see the exhibition, which is currently at the Addison through the summer and will open at the VMFA at the end of September. The last thing I'll say is that Greg and I had to work on this exhibition at an unusual time, one that I think actually in many ways was providential for the show. And that is 2 things. One, we were sort of working on it during the pandemic, which meant that a lot of things were changing and coming into focus sort of in American culture, and particularly in the South. But also that we had, in some ways, limits put on our resources. We couldn't travel as widely, our budgets were in question, and that meant that we had to actually drill down into the collections that we were using, the Heights collection, Addison, VMFA, and other areas. And at first, what seemed like a limit was actually a gift, because I think when you can choose from every collection in the world, you end up sort of gravitating towards things you know or you think you should have. And for us, it was just a real voyage of discovery as well for things we had in our collections. I know that many more things have come out and will come out that people say, oh, I wish I had known you were doing the show. But we're extremely happy that we were able to really utilize collections widely and deeply from our lending institutions. And the last thing I'll say is it's also enabled us really to bring in, especially the VMFA, a lot of great contemporary work into the collection. And I think the section of living artists sort of in dialogue with this longer sweep of history is the thing that for me has been most rewarding and interesting to think about the interplay, the transformation of technologies, the transformation of history, culture, idea, but also the resonances we see over Civil War and then civil rights and contemporary practices.
So about a third of the show and the book are photographs that were made since the year 2000, so there's a real emphasis on contemporary photography. As Sarah mentioned, the Picturing the South show from 1996 also touched on some contemporary photography, but it was maybe a tenth of that entire checklist, so there wasn't quite as much of a focus on recent photography at that time. And so we wanted to, knowing that show and knowing how much great work is being made in the South, we wanted to really emphasize recent work that's been made in the region. Because there's so much important and fantastic photography being made in the South, and it's not getting anywhere near the attention it deserves, and so we have this great platform, and so we really wanted to emphasize that. As Sarah mentioned, we started working on this show during the pandemic, so there was a lot of topics, a lot of discussions about race and representation and identity, about storytelling and history, and kind of how that history is still present in the present, I guess you would say. And so a lot of the work that we were looking at is kind of thinking about the history of photography, thinking about the history of the South, thinking about how identity is articulated in photographs, and how the South is really changing. And a lot of the photographers are asking questions about what does it mean to be Southern, who is a Southerner, and who gets to tell these stories. It also does kind of, it reflects, the current moment. The show ends on this kind of intentionally ambiguous note where there's a sense of optimism in the way that the South is changing, how the demographics are changing, how it's a much more open and inclusive and diverse place. And it's also a place that reflects a lot of the tensions that exist in contemporary culture. And those two truths exist right alongside one another. But it's also really important to note that kind of how integral, again, to get back to some of our first points, how integral the South is to American photography, to American identity. And you see this throughout the history of photography, but particularly in recent photography, that as photographers are trying to grapple with what does it mean to be American, they tend to come to the South to make those pictures. And so with that, we're going to start talking to a couple photographers about it.
All right, I think now there's another PowerPoint.
Yeah. And while the slideshows are getting turned over,
Yes.
as Sarah mentioned, the book, sorry, we have a monitor here, but you can't see
yes.
it.
Can't see
The book was published by Aperture. It has 10 fantastic essays by some really important writers, and over 275 illustrations in it, and many of the photographers will be here to sign copies of the book at 2:30 at the Aperture booth if you're interested in saying hello and picking up a copy. So forgive the shameless plug. We have a captive audience, and I would be remiss if we didn't at least promote it a bit.
And while we're waiting for that to load, here we go. And we're just going to show you a kind of rotating slideshow of the work of each of our guest artists. We would just like you to talk a little bit about your work each. Who wants to start? Carolyn, you want to start?
Okay, I'll
'Cause your
start.
work is
Okay.
up.
Your work is
Just a 5-minute
so this
overview.
work, Knit Club, it's called Knit Club, and it began, I think, around 2012 when I moved back to the United States after living in Istanbul for about a decade. And my partner and I felt we wanted to reconnect with this country and make work in a place that was where we came from. And Andres was mostly from the West Coast. I had background in the East and the West Coast, and we ended up wanting to instead go to the middle of the country. So we took a road trip from Omaha, Nebraska to New Orleans to do some research and decide where to live and make work. And we ended up in Water Valley, Mississippi. And that's a whole longer story, but so we moved to this small town near Oxford, Mississippi, and even though we were had this plan to reconnect and turn towards something we knew, the place that we knew, we found ourselves in a culture that felt very foreign to us. And so it was actually very much of a struggle to figure out how to make work in this town in Mississippi, which was kind of part of the Deep South. And so I kept struggling through that question and feeling like an outsider. And we eventually moved away after 2 years, but I kept coming back. And finally, I took this trip back without my camera, and I came back to work with a friend of mine who's a textile artist on this sewing project. And so a group of her friends and me sat in the circle in her studio, basically a sewing circle, embroidering these rugs for like 2 weeks, and talking and venting, and lots of women talk, because all of us were women, and most of them were mothers. And that was kind of the inception of this knit club project. Because finally I felt, actually, by putting down the camera, I had become more of an insider in this place. And my attraction to this group of women, and this group of women who had children, and this whole like female-coded craft of sewing, I was asking myself these questions, like, why am I all of a sudden attracted to these things that I had spent a lot of my life as a photographer running away from? And so those questions about my relationship to the construct of femininity and womanhood kind of became the core of the work that I was making there. And I guess the last thing I could say is just, rather than making documentary pictures trying to show, oh, this is what this knit club community is like, it was more of a staging pictures, creating pictures. I felt like I was at a point in my photo life where I really needed to break away from reinforcing what is already out there, and using photography more as a way to create what I want things to be, or what I feel things should be or are, rather than this kind of heavy, I guess I started to feel like documentary photography was kind of a heavy burden, and so I started shifting the way I was using it.
That's a good transition to bring your work in, RaMell. If you can give us an overview as well, at least of the project that we have on view in A Long Arc, and the film, I think, too, if you can touch on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, of course. Nice to see some familiar faces, Richard and Jess. It seems to me like you're a liberated documentarian as well.
Yeah, I like that. I was gonna steal that from you,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
I've never heard it before.
I made it up, but it doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. It was still a figment of my imagination, and it came from very similar concerns of just being burdened by this sort of journalistic, photojournalistic, writing journalistic history of knowledge production that is tied to ideas of truth and integrity that have always been incredibly muddy, and as we know more now, are sort of rooted in a very Enlightenment scientific view of the world, which really excludes a large portion of the rest of the world. And so being able to come to a point of understanding with the power of the narratives of the past to force you into a mode of making, and the desires to explore the world in a way that feels more authentic to your lived experience, I think encourages one to be liberated from the traditions of the past while keeping them in tight consideration. But when you all see the photographs of mine that come up, it says South County, Alabama, Hale County. And South County is not a real county. It's a fictional county. And I kind of constructed it as the sort of south of consciousness. One could say the subconscious, but I think that's too Freudian. I think it's like the unconscious, people say now. And a space where sort of our imaginations produce what we're seeing in the world. I think it's maybe Henry Bergson, who said something along the lines of, history is coterminous with vision, or something, in which when you're seeing something, there's not possible to, you need your memory to acknowledge what's happening. You need culture to decipher what you're seeing. People are seeing the world, they somehow believe that it's not loaded with all of the burdens of the past. And so to make images in the South, to me, is to sort of return to the home of my identity, at least as a Black person, as an African American. I like to call it the cul-de-sac for African American identity, because obviously the ties to culture and the continent of Africa were severed in the transatlantic slave trade. I ended up there in 2009, coincidentally, to teach photography and to coach basketball and work in a youth program called Youth Build. And I was a photographer, and I loved photography. I was obsessed over image making, and I wanted to be a photojournalist and did that for a while, then couldn't find my way in it. Wanted to be a conceptual sort of photo illustrative photographer, couldn't find my way in it. And then I started working with students, and it was the first students that were more my peers than the students I'd worked with in the past. And it was the first time I was approached with the problem of representation in a way which was disheartening enough for me not to make images of a certain type. I photographed from 2009 to 2012 in Hale County, Alabama, and I don't show those images because they're good in that they reflect the history of photography and what the sort of road trip kitsch that people fall into when they travel in the South, the romanticism that is natural when you're in a place for the first time. You're attached to icons of familiarity. But at some point, after 3 years of arduously making images and being whoa, this image is beautiful, but it's too formally consistent with something that is not personal to me, I made the image I Home, which is the one we have here with my hand. And I think to kind of wrap my little spiel up, the breakthrough for that to me was one thing that photography does, which we know so well, is it feigns ubiquity. It feigns almost the God view, right? Which is why it was so powerful as a proponent of racism, in that you give someone a racist idea, and then you give them an image, and now that racist idea is part of their deciphering, regardless of whether or not they believe it. It's embedded in the way in which they look, because you produced that sort of knowledge, and there's no, and it can make sense. Every image can make sense with any meaning if you wanted to. And so me putting my hand, it took the authorship away from the sort of God figure or the universal, and then it was mine, and then that kind of led me to think about how to really truly embed my point of view into the image itself, so that the images were no longer in this space where they were more easily read in a very specific way. And maybe we'll get into details later. Sorry for the strange raveling abstractions.
We have questions, but you've answered some of them. I think we should throw them out and just, just throw in a
Are we
curveball
done?
question? No.
Anyone else has any questions?
I have different questions. What I'm saying is, rather than follow the script, one thing I noticed, we were gonna ask you kind of what drew you to the South, which I think you've both answered in different ways, and what shaped your photographic imaginary of the South sort of before you got there. But what I hear from both of you is this sort of rejection. I mean, it was coming to terms with it. So if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of how your photographic imagination of the South, or maybe it's not a photographic one, what you had, what you encountered, how that changed. Because Carolyn, you talked about you had to actually put down the camera in order to be able to see and then make pictures. And you made pictures for 3 years that you won't show anybody. So I'm curious about if you could elaborate, each of you on, because we're also interested in the weight of this history on contemporary artists.
I was thinking about the visual Southern histories that had maybe informed my thinking about the South, and it's definitely I think the story and mythology of the South comes a lot from films like Jim Jarmusch, and everything from that to Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation, and the knowledge about these stories that created violent racism, but also a romanticism. I mean, the Jim Jarmusch stuff is, I think, pretty romantic and youthful, but also as a child growing up in Maryland, which is, you could consider Southern, I think there a lot of the civil rights images had an impact on me, and from the 60s and 50s, and those images, I think, were used to inform me of a history of the United States that was also kind of romantic. Like, those suggested to me through the way they were presented to me that now we're in a different place, and all the problems of the past are solved. And I think that's the history that I learned of America as a child. And then also, when I was in college, I was researching for a documentary film company that was making films about Atlanta, like the history of America told through the story of Atlanta. So I was in the Library of Congress researching battlefield photos from the Civil War, but that was also this kind of romantic propagandistic history of our country, and it's always like the problem has been solved. And so my association with documentary, and then I learned that I need to push back against that and question that and create something that's alternative to the kind of the stories that pose as facts, I guess.
I mean, you were photographing in a place that has kind of become synonymous with Southern photography. I mean, it's not a densely populated place. It's not a place I think a lot of people visit. But anyone who knows photography knows knows Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. They know William Christenberry's photographs. So there is a lot of that history right there where you were making pictures. Like, and you've done shows alongside Christenberry's work. Like, how are you thinking about that history, and where did that send you as you were making pictures?
Yeah, I think about it too much, probably, because I can't help but just wonder, and these are sort of like unfair, self-reflective thought experiments, just like, what just the world looks like before, what a culture looks like before it's curated by the people who came before you, right? It's kind of a silly question, because this is like the momentum of the human experiment. Like, there's no way to not know. It's like it's an impossible thing, but I know the South because my dad grew up in North Carolina. It's its own part of the South, Charlotte, North Carolina, and he has stories of trying to be killed by white people and riots in his schools. I also have consumed the same media that you've consumed, and so there's not many complex and like life and essence-filled depictions of the place. Like, they just don't exist. And obviously there are some, but most of them aren't. So I enter into the place thinking that the people aren't with all the stereotypes, that the people aren't as smart as the other people, that like it's a place that's abandoned, it's a place that's still war-torn. The reason why there's no violence there is because everyone's fine with the racism, and it was so bad before that they don't want to like talk about the things, and all of the stereotypes, which I try to work through in my images. And so going there to make a photo and taking a photo and having the photo look like the photos of the past, which don't have the reflexivity of what we know now socially, which is that the South isn't those things, and there's been a particular, like when someone, the best example is like when someone goes to make a documentary film about a black family, you go into that house looking for notions of blackness that are familiar so that you can make the film about the black family. So then that goes out into the world, and then you have a film about a black family in which the person pursued blackness in a way that was familiar to them, because when they go to make that film, they have a budget, they have limited time, they're like all these things that force them to like make meaning in very specific ways. Most of the photography and most of the films always have some essentializing element that overproduces or over-directs the viewer, and 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 years of this produces very singular and very reductively iconic representations of place. And so making images, I found when I recognized immediately when I made an image that looked like a William Christian Berry image, or looked like a Walker Evans image, or just looked like someone who, and they didn't photograph in those ways. It was a different time then, and they were singular people doing singularly important things. But as a whole, it became obvious that I was unable to take an image that wasn't that until I had gone through every one of their images myself.
Well, that also raises another question for both of you, which is how you work with the communities and the people you photograph, and like what sort of that charged encounter, even if we call it collaboration and staging, whatever, it's always it's a particular encounter, because you both photograph with people. Like, can you tell us a little bit more about that, and just the ways in which you've learned about yourself working with others, and how they've changed your photography, and also maybe filmmaking too for you as well.
Should I go?
Yeah.
I think as I've spent more time as a photographer, I've become more and more resistant to its traditions and uncomfortable with repeating the traditions. And so the idea of like the photographer and the subject, and the photographer dominating or exploiting the subject, is so powerful in my head that I can barely even take a picture anymore. And so, there's a lot of people who don't believe that's what photography does, and that's fine, but that's what I've come to after many, many years of working as a photographer. And so so my work is kind of constantly pushing against that and trying to, maybe can I, it's very optimistic in a way, like, can I turn photography into something else? And so part of what I've tried to do over a long period of time recently is work collaboratively, and so I'm still taking the picture most of the time, but in this work, it was a participatory thing, so we would brainstorm together, and usually there were one person would stand in front of the camera, but someone else would be behind the camera helping with the lights, or going to get a prop, or suggesting a location. And so it was collective in a way, but the problem remains that I'm the author, and so in next projects that I've pursued after that, I continue to try and push against photography's like one-sided, dominant nature, controlling nature.
Authorial.
How about you?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think a breakthrough for me was when I came across Wendy Ewald's work.
Me too.
Yeah?
Same.
Also in the show.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just a beautiful, beautiful photo. Oh my gosh. Yeah, in that, like the image just obviously doesn't have to be one-sided, and you can still be obsessed with making an aesthetic object, or you can still be really thrilled to like revel in the beauty of one's, artistic imagination with someone else being a full contributor and sort of integrated in the image, and that might not necessarily be visible depending on the way in which the image is made, but it relieves something that is that's around intention that produces an object that has sort of ethical resonances, I think, across a different mode of touching or something, or in the way in which the image touches people. For me, I was fortunate enough to I went to Helltown, Alabama to teach and to coach and to teach photography and whatnot, and so I was known in the community as a teacher and as someone who could help someone get into a college or help them fill out some paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I started to make a film, and when I really thought I understood how to make images that had the sort of strategic ambiguity that could bring some complexity to what we know as notions of blackness, and specifically notions of blackness in the South. I had relationships to do anything, you know. I'm filming with a couple guys over 5 years, and you know, I'm filming child's births to children naked in the tub, and am not even sort of questioning my fluidity because I knew them for 3 years before I started filming, and they never questioned my desires or aims because I'd always been there in a sort of social role. And so I kind of take that forward with me in that, and I love that you said you put the camera down, that you did that's even cooler, but that you shared that because a lot of people always think that you have to photograph it all, and like the shot's the most important thing. But you could spend 10 years with someone and take one photo, and that one photo could be way more meaningful than 400,000 you take over the course of that 10 years because of the time before.
Yeah, and there's also something about you could spend, you know, months with someone taking pictures in a family's life and just always being behind the camera, and it doesn't necessarily nurture a real relationship with them. And so I felt that a lot of my past work, I had created that problem where I'm thinking I'm using photography as a way to connect with people, but actually I'm just hiding behind the camera, so it's kind of a crutch or a barrier between us. And the camera, you know, even if you develop this relationship with people and then 4 months later you take a picture, when you're taking the picture, you're kind of creating a barrier between you, and it disrupts your relationship in a way. So, yeah, or, you know, but there's people who would totally not see it that way, and there's many.
Well, there's so many modes of photography, obviously, and there's so many needs for photography from, you know, doctors who are using the camera to see inside the human body, you know, to surveillance. A camera, to surveillance, to, you know, someone who is just photographing pieces of paper that will be disintegrating soon because of a science experiment, to ID cards, and so it's really difficult to, you know, be deeply thoughtful in every single mode in which the lens is lensing, but.
Well, also like the iPhone and, you know, people's use of their phones as cameras and ways of self-representation and spreading through social media is something that I think has changed the idea of professional photography or art photography, because so many more people are telling their own stories and able to, so what's the purpose? You know, like, it's more, the professional photographer now becomes outdated or archaic in a way, their point of view.
Maybe this is when we turn the questions to these two.
Uh-oh.
And ask them.
That's not how this is.
No, but really,
Yeah,
I wonder,
ask us, yeah.
I wonder, I mean, not to go left field to social media, but I wonder, as curators and those who are deeply invested in not only the academic history, but the practical history of photography, how those cameras like figure into the way in which you all think about what you're gonna present to the world, and or how it like, does it rewrite the history, you know?
I have kind of like a hedgy, dodgy answer to this question.
Those are the best ones.
Because if you look further back in the history of photography, there are all of these pictures that were never made with any kind of artistic intent. Because this is mostly like an art history of photography that we're telling here. But a lot of the pictures, you know, particularly in, you know, definitely in the 19th century, very early in the 20th century, and then kind of periodically throughout. You know, there are pictures that were made for one purpose. Someone discovers it and they see something that is meaningful, you know, or aesthetically engaging, and suddenly that gets integrated into this art history of photography that we're telling. And we've done that. You know, they're like all of, you know, Barnard's pictures, the O'Sullivans, the studio portraits, you know, from the 19th century. You know, that was done for like exactly the same reasons that people make pictures to share on Instagram. But then there's also pictures like Dis Farmer or the Massengills, you know, where they're being made at a time when they're really, like the idea of an artist photographer is out there. And so like it's hard to say like how much of an awareness that is that they had while they were making those pictures, and yet there's clearly a sensibility about how the medium works and what the medium does, and they're using it in a very intentional way, whether it ever was shown on the walls of a gallery or published in a book. That intention, that vehicle maybe didn't exist to them, but it's so integral to the way that we all understand photography and use photography that I think it's really impossible to separate the two. I mean, it's one of the things that's so great about this medium is that it's real messy, and we don't talk too much about like vernacular sculptors. Like, there's not a lot of functional sculpture that people use, but there's a lot of functional pictures, and that informs the way that artists use pictures. It informs the way that we as historians and curators understand pictures and present pictures.
Yeah, and I think that double-edged nature of the medium, the oppressive and the liberatory has been there from the beginning. And even before people had access, to self-representation through the camera, a broad swath of people, I think there were creative uses and reuses of photography. I mean, I think about Victorian women's photo collages. Of course, these are all like very privileged women, but they would take pictures and cut them up and put a new narrative on them. So when people always talk about, oh, the iPhone is going to transform photography, or digital will, or this, it's the end of one thing. It's just the continuation of the story. It's a medium for expression that, is kind of always being used in these different ways. And I think, maybe just to bring it back also to the subject of this exhibition and your work, that double-edged nature of photography and how it's used to liberate, to stereotype, to try to control, to open up, is maybe particularly salient in the South, or maybe I just want to think about that right now. But I guess that also sort of leads me, and probably is time to lead us to questions for the audience. But I guess the last question I wanted to ask you, and then maybe we'll open up for questions here, is when you were talking about sort of the weight of your interactions with communities. I mean, Carolyn, you put down the camera, but you actually started doing something else. You started making other things. And you actually, maybe film and photography came at the same time. But did you feel that particular pressure in the South? Like, was it something about the relationship to the place you were in? Or do you think that happens for you anywhere that you make work, because it's how you're now imagining yourselves as artists operating in the world with this material and technology?
Well, I think in the South I found craft to be pretty vibrant, and so that's one of the things I drew on to make my photographs, because it was one of the things that was meaningful there. But also, I mean, I'm really interested in the idea that how our culture, segregates craft and art, and what meanings that creates and what hierarchies that creates, or inequalities. And so, I've also appropriated some of their crafts and played with them myself.
Right.
And so learning from the people, and yeah, that's also just photography, just kind of trying to push boundaries a little bit. So if my photography becomes something that's more than just photography, but has other, mixing media, is something I do partly because I just always feel like I want to push boundaries a little bit. Like it's also not just intellectual thought, but also, or political, but also just psychic. Like I feel inside like pushing.
Yeah, and RaMell, we should also mention that in addition to filmmaking and photography, I mean, in your recent work, you've also done kind of sculpture and performance. I mean, you've integrated other practices as well.
At the welcoming of my friend Richard McCabe here, who gave me, was a curator at the Ogden Museum, who is the one that kind of gave me basically a floor of their museum to do work, which was great because I had never done any sculpture, never done any performance. So yeah, just of course a shout out to my friend. In thinking about your question, I think that it's less about, for me, being in the South And the more that you know, it's like once you start to educate yourself, you're in trouble, you know, if you're a responsible person. Or if you have that sort of ethical drive, which not everyone has and not everyone should have. But I think when I started to truly learn about the history of photography and truly read about the history of representation, and I really started to learn about the history that we don't quite learn in school, which is anything about Black history, you're like, wow, I can't make a straight photo. I just can't, because this photo has participated. Like, I call photography, I'm like a photography cynic and skeptic, and I love it, you know, in like the James Baldwin way, and like, you know, you are allowed to, you know, really criticize things you love. But it's, yeah, I'm kind of losing my train of thought because I'm so excited.
I think criticizing things you love is
Yeah.
a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
But I think you're saying that it's not really, the seed may have been germinating in the South, but it's now part of who you are in the world and how you think about what you do.
Well, this is what I wanted to say, thank you. Is that I like to call film and photography the technology of racism, in that they allow you to believe anything that you want. And so with that in mind, you can take that into any field or anything, or you cannot. You can just do the thing and not care about the history of the thing that you're doing. Like, that's on you, and you may not be on the other end of the consequences of that. But, you know, once you start to read, you know, you're in trouble.
Pandora's box.
Yeah, so.
Well, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions.
And there's a mic here as well.
So I found the concept of liberated documentarian or photographer, artist, curator, both thrilling and problematic. And so when I think of liberation, you know, we were liberated, you know, through knowledge and progress. That the world is not flat, and most people believe it. Or we were liberated from drawing or the camera obscura by the camera. And so my question is, and Sarah started talking about it, and intimated some of the positive things about the past and the oppressive nature of the products. And so, you know, I know one of my lines from T.S. Eliot, after such knowledge, what forgiveness? I'm curious, what in the past that you can embrace and forgive so that it can be integrated as it is in the show. And, you know, I can, you know, after reading Earl Morris's Seeing Believing, I can know that Fenton moved cannonballs on and off the road in the Valley of Death, and I can feel manipulated, and I can still love the picture. And so I'm curious about, as artists, what you can, you know, embrace despite, you know, and there's also the academic arguments and then the heart and the human. So that's why I focused on the word forgiveness.
Are you a preacher?
A what?
A preacher? That was
He
a very
preaches
That was a
sometimes.
very graceful and religious. Maybe that's just my title.
I'm a lover. I love art. I love artists. I love history.
Yeah.
You know, and so I want to understand and grow.
Love the question.
I think it's kind of like if, you know, you might as well commit suicide if you're going to give up on solving things. Or you have to keep believing in something, that something's possible in order to have life and soul and trying and navigating around the evils of it. I mean, and that's what I would say. Like, if I were to give up on making things work right, then I might as well just go in a hole.
Yeah, I don't. I think I'm like, I'm trying to like find a better way to say incredibly forgiving, but like I hold no animosity towards those who grew up in a time in which human nature hadn't evolved to the point of being as liberated as a lot of us claim that we are. You know, I don't know what I would be like if I was born then. Like, who knows? Like, I can't say that I would be one way or not. Like, I'm a product of being middle class, of 2 parents that were in the military, 2 parents who were in love, beautiful family. Like, all those things are why I had the audacity to think I can be an artist, you know? Growing up in a different situation, I don't know. And so I don't, you know, I don't blame folks for using the camera in the way in which they unwittingly did according to today's understanding of the world. But I will speak emphatically and absolutely about a way to address those problems now. And I don't have time to praise everyone for all of their contributions to the world, even if it's Heidegger, who was also a Nazi, you know, but being one of the most brilliant people that's ever existed. Like, I'm not going to speak about the good stuff. I'm going to talk about the bad stuff, perhaps, because in the way in which I'm trying to articulate a way to participate in the world, and this, you know, Gare Bradley calls it a belief system, a photograph. I think just like general knowledge production. It's more useful for me to talk about things in a very narrow and straight way because it just gets muddy and people have short attention spans and all the words are burdened. But I love the question because I think about that a lot, and I think as curators, you are teachers fundamentally, but I think I teach in college, and I think the hardest thing is to like have the students understand when something was created in the world and the ideology and the beliefs and the words that were used then. It's not now. You know too much. Like then, this wasn't the case. This was the most profound piece of work that was ever made then. No one had ever done what was happening. But to them, like because they can do it on their iPhones really fast, it's like, it's just a photo of this. It's like, you don't understand, you know?
I'm not as easily forgiving of the people from the past as you are, I think. Like,
I'm not talking about plantation owners now.
Okay, you're talking about
I mean, like, not someone who was
the white
who
male
had,
photographers.
like, I mean, maybe them, I don't know. It's not today's
I've allowed myself to carry rage
yeah.
In the present, for better or worse.
Could I just say one thing about the show and the book? Is that this contradiction, this complexity is something that is right there from the very beginning of the exhibition. You know, the show starts with these 2 pictures, both of, you know, a pair of people. One is a mammy portrait of an enslaved woman holding, you know, the young white child that she cared for, whose family also owned her. And then right next to that is a portrait of a pair of freedmen. So photography at the very same time is this source of oppression and a way of reestablishing and reinforcing racial hierarchies, and also a way of, you know, articulating a different way and a different way of being. You know, these 2 men weren't even considered citizens, and yet there they are before the camera, you know, declaring themselves as men, as human beings, as people of consequence. And that contradiction is right there from the very beginning of the medium.
I think we have time for one more question. Very patiently.
You've kind of hit me in a lot of different ways, so I'm trying to articulate it in a concise way. My father was a photographer in Atlanta. He was born on Morehouse's campus, raised on Spelman's campus. He documented, he was their campus photographer also. And so one question I have for you is, in your collection, are you going into the collections of Morehouse, of Spelman, of Auburn Avenue, of all those places, because it is documented? Your question about some of what you say is very stereotypical to me, because the photographs that my dad took in that era were about humanity and about what was happening on the, let's call it the black side of Atlanta. And it was a lot of good stuff happening, and part of that documentation was to show that there was good stuff happening, okay? So I kind of don't go with that. I understand what you're saying, but I don't go with that.
Don't go with what? I don't know what you're not going with.
No, because you say you're pulling away from, let's call it the stereotypical, the racist it just sounds like you're just saying that all those photographs are racism oriented. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
A little bit, but that's okay. Well, we can
Okay,
figure
we
it out
can deal
another
with
time.
that. But my question also is how many of the photographers that are in this exhibition are from the South, grew up in it?
About half of them are either are native Southerners or have moved to the South or live in the South, and about half are from other places. And that was, as we were putting together the checklist, we were very conscientious about that balance. And as you kind of go through the chapters and throughout the history, the balance of who's from the South and who's from away shifts. Like certainly toward the beginning, a lot of the photographers came from the North to make pictures in the South. But as you move further into the history, there are a lot more Southerners making those pictures, and that tension is something that's also really important about the way that we understand the South and the way that the South is portrayed, because there's a sense of familiarity that creates a certain kind of picture and brings a certain kind of knowledge to those pictures, but then also that novelty that comes from seeing a place for the first time also has a lot of value. And how we do, no one on this stage is actually a native Southerner, if I'm not mistaken. I'm from Massachusetts. Sarah's from California.
Virginian, though. We're going to claim RaMell
Yeah.
as a Virginian.
Yeah, below the Mason-Dixon line.
Okay.
But I wanted to, first of all, I'd love to talk to you afterwards about your father's work.
Yeah.
I think, though, that there is a really rich history of picture making within the South, particularly community portraiture, by and for Black Americans. And there are some of those in the exhibition. We have work by P.H. Polk, of course, who was the first photographer at Tuskegee, but also Robert McNeil, a Black photographer from Virginia who made pictures of a project called The Negro in Virginia in 1940, but really, positive, complicated, beautiful, but really pictures that responded to the sense of self that those sitters brought, to the camera. So that is a big part of the exhibition. I also think, though, that you've identified there are incredible pictorial resources throughout this country that are not in museums necessarily, that are in historical repositories, that are in artists' collections, that are in places like historic New Orleans as well as their neighbors, the Ogden, and like Duke University, the Center for Documentary Studies. And we have this artificial divide between the photography that goes in a museum and photography that goes elsewhere, but it is completely artificial. Those boundaries are breaking down, and we've seen a lot of great work by our colleagues, like Brian Piper at New Orleans did a book on Black studio photographers. So this, I think our understanding is changing thanks to the work of people like your father.
I just wanted to add, he was the first roving editor for Ebony. He did a story about Atlanta with Langston Hughes, and his photos are all over the story.
What was his name?
Griff Davis. The other piece is, what about Southerners who go global? Their perspective on global things, because he also went global. So it's, I say that because he went global at a time when colonialism was going on in Africa, and he was in Africa, and he could relate to that because of what was happening in Atlanta. So, the South kind of travels.
Yeah.
That might be the idea that Sarah and I steal for our next show.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd love to talk to you. I think, do we have time for any more questions? We have to wrap up. It's 2:03. We're supposed to be at it, yeah. So I think, thank you very much. We'll be happy to
Thank you all
talk
for
to
coming.
you. Thank you to our panelists, especially our artists willing to come up here and bare their souls a little bit.